entirely responsible for inflicting me on the historians community because he wrote a letter to the University of California Press
you remember that.
in the early 1980s suggesting he ought to take a look at a manuscript that I had written, which was then under consideration at Oxford, and I had already gotten the readers' reports. But I thought, hey, why not try California? If they say no, I can always go back to Oxford. Then California said yes. And so ever since then, early modern France has had to suffer the consequences. But years later, I got to sort of return the favor because John's recent book on the Rohan family, well known to me for obvious reasons, I was one of the readers. Maybe I was the only reader. I don't know.
No, Rob Schneider.
Oh, Robbie Schneider, yeah. Well, he was here earlier this semester.
Yes.
So it's a very enclosed little world. You probably have noticed that virtually every person we've had here this semester, I either reviewed their tenure or ended up as an editor or whatever of one of their books. I suppose that's a testimony to the system being rigged or something. I don't know. That's intellectual gerrymandering. And so we usually start off by quickly going around the room and everyone introducing themselves, and then I turn it over to John. So.
Hi, I'm Laura Goffman. I'm a PhD student in Modern Middle East history.
Natalie Donnell, first year. Lee Stevens, a PhD student in early modern France.
Nathan Michaelwitz, I'm a fifth year at George Mason University.
Stas?
Stas, PhD student, Russian history. Here.
Yeah, I'm Safan Khan. I'm a working while in modern France PhD student.
I'm Ashley Corwin. I'm a PhD student as well, seventh year.
Jacob Burnham, PhD student, third year.
Elizabeth.
I'm Luke Frederick. I'm a PhD student in U.S. history.
Okay, I'm Machiko. I'm a Japanese scholar. I'm here for sabbatical.
Pat Fleming. I've honored a number of classes here, including a couple from Professor Collins. But today I'm riding shotgun for my sister-in-law.
I'm Kat Doherty. I'm a Dominican sister, and I got my PhD here in late modern France in '84. And I was a TA for Professor Schiller.
Really? Wow.
STA.
Elizabeth Cross, assistant professor here at Georgetown. I work on 18th century France.
Jim Schnell, Central Europe, mostly the Habsburg monarchy.
I'm Jim Collins. All right, John.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Jim for inviting me, and also for the thought of both organizing this series of seminars, but organizing them in honor of Bill Beik. And Bill, I assume we're the only ones who knew him here. He was genuinely a wonderful man. He was both extremely gentle, good-humored, open, but also extraordinarily rigorous, serious about scholarship, and then serious about his ethical commitments. And I think the overlay between his ethics and his scholarship is one of the things that is going to sort of pop up occasionally in my comments here today. As it happens, Bill had a big role in my own scholarly life. When I was an undergraduate, my college handed out a little bits of research money after our junior year, some of us. And so I wound up in Toulouse, where Bill was finishing up his dissertation, and Bill introduced me to the archives. His father happened to be a teacher of mine in school. So Bill is kind of at the moment where I seriously got engaged in thinking about France and thinking about French history. This being the summer of 1967, and that sort of date in a kind of symbolic way seems to me the kind of focus for what I want to what I want to discuss today. Because as Jim suggested, at least in your correspondence with me of organizing this series, early modern French studies as we know them today seem to me, in some ways a product of the '68 generation, very, very loosely understood. It had a very limited existence before the mid to later 60s, may be receding now in the current intellectual mood. So my thought was to talk about both the trajectory of my own historical thinking, mix that up with the institutional matrices within which this thinking emerged, and use that in a sense as a way both to understand some of the contours of French history as it's practiced, especially by us Americans. So some of the content, and then to think of it as a way of understanding the trajectory. So there's going to be a mix here of the personal and the collective, and I guess there are going to be probably some points of unclarity along the way. So by all means, ask questions as they occur to you, or wait till afterward. The choice of France itself was probably not very surprising for someone in my kind of age category in the later 60s. France, weirdly, was extraordinarily present in the America of the 50s and 60s. French movies were all over the place. I grew up in suburban St. Louis, and I think partly because the French could include sex scenes that we couldn't hear, there was always a market for them. Hemingway and Fitzgerald were in the high school curricula and so on. For me, growing up at that moment, the part of what France was, and I think part of the reason that maybe several of us got drawn into French studies, had to do with France as an alternative modernity, a kind of version of our world, but different, with a different kind of politics, of course, with different urban landscapes that we saw in all those movies. So French history for me, and like I said, I think for others of my generation, began out of a kind of American questioning, sort of reflection on what's the road the U.S. did not take, what is it about our society, seen through this alternate reality kind of lens. So France, I think, was a maybe overdetermined choice for a number of us at that point. And I think it goes with an undercurrent in all us French historians, a kind of intensity of engagement with the place, and just an intensity of concern about it, the sort of quality of a sort of up and down love affair that we get aggravated, we break up, we make up, that kind of thing. The focus on France in this 1967-68 moment, then I think quite predictable. Focus on the early modern period, I think way less predictable. And I think what's interesting to reflect on as I try to think about what our field is and how it has evolved, is start with the thought that in the US, in the 1960s, early modern French history as we know it barely existed. And that's an extreme overstatement, but I don't think it's a misleading overstatement. Most history departments, when I was intellectually growing up, had a clear division of labor, or sort of demarcation of zones. So basically, you had an Italian Renaissance specialist for the 15th century, possibly into the 16th. You had a Reformation specialist, normally a German Reformation specialist for the 16th. You had an England specialist for the 17th century and the English Revolution. And then France was reserved essentially for the 18th century, AKA the Revolution, because that was the function that French studies played in the American university context. The French Revolution, its antecedents, both in the Enlightenment and in the sort of crack of the old regime, and then its consequences in 19th century history. Of course, there were exceptions to this. There was William Church at Brown. There was Russell Major at Emory. Horace Ranum first at Columbia and then at Hopkins. So there were exceptions, but there weren't all that many of them. And even they, to some extent, proved the rule. Natalie Davis, who of course became a sort of central figure in creating the early modern field, her first significant article was published in a Reformation journal. I mean, and so she sort of slotted into Reformation history. Russell Major, his first works were published in in a series of constitutional histories, so that the notion of an autonomous social history of early modern France barely existed. I think it's striking that Horace Ranum studied with John Wolfe at Minnesota. Wolfe, who started as a 19th century historian before eventually turning to the earlier period. So what you had is a sort of intellectual landscape without our kind of zone in it, without a blank spot on the map where most of us are currently situated. Along with that is the fact that French history itself was actually a fairly small field in the 50s and 60s. It's expanded enormously in the last generation, but very quite a just numerically limited. My first French history conference, we now have these two enormous French history conferences, but there was basically one panel per time slot. Now I think there's about 40. I don't know. So early modern was a kind of blank spot, and of course, that vacuum, I think, on its own attracted a good deal of interest, but it offered the possibility of a kind of sort of radical openness. I mean, just the fact that there was nothing much there at that point. The third element, and here's I guess where some of my most interest, to me the interest looking back at my own trajectory comes. Third component, there's the France component, the early modern absence component. Third component has to do with the late 60s moment and the politics of university in that world. In some ways not, but in some ways, the late 60s moment was an especially kind of appealing time for the kind of intellectual reconstruction or sort of just reconfiguring that wound up happening. Some of that, of course, was just because of the chaos that so many universities found themselves in, the unsettlement of the academic world at large. I went through graduate school at Berkeley, and what was striking there, and kind of extraordinary looking back on it, is that a lot of professors who've been, by reputation, very dictatorial, only a few years before, were pretty much willing to let us go any way we wished. I think we wound up as kind of, we encountered a lower degree, a lower level of mentoring than was common at all just a few years earlier, or has become common sense. I don't know if your experience was similar, but I think a lot of us found ourselves basically designing our own fields just because the teachers who might have been guiding us simply had other things on their mind, or simply were destabilized in other ways. Along with that, of course, and I think it's easy to miss this, the intellectual atmosphere of the 1960s was shaped by the fact that departments were expanding fast. All sorts of new people were showing up. But weirdly, because people were assumed to be, there were just lots of jobs around, people were being fired like crazy as well. There was a turnover of Berkeley, as it happened, in my time there, fired 3 straight French historians. I eventually wound up working with Natalie Davis, but she didn't arrive till the very end of my time there. So I wound up doing my dissertation with a specialist on the 14th and 15th century Italian Renaissance. A wonderful guy named Jean Brucker who just died. But the sense of nobody was guiding us. We really were figuring it out altogether on our own. A sense of free-range graduate school, basically, to an extraordinary degree. With all of the costs that you might anticipate. I mean, it's an incredibly wasteful system. A ton of my fellow students never finished. We had to figure out for ourselves all sorts of basic method and literature questions that now I would just, we would just ask someone. And then to top it off, just as I was entering graduate school, the job crisis hit. It's probably not as bad as it is now, but starting in 1968, things were, jobs ceased to be common. So that there too, there's an incredible sense of wastage, of people going off to do other things. For those of us who survived it all, though, I mean, just by accident, Jim describes the publication process, and that sense of, just something happened and things worked out. The early modern field, as it exists, I think, as my generation cobbled it together, in some ways was a product of a moment of radical freedom. I mean, just the sense that of multiple possibilities going on. All of it, like I said, not an easy experience, because I think none of us was confident about getting a job or surviving the program. But the sense of kind of open-endedness of what we were doing. And that continued in my first academic job, where I stayed for a long time at the University of California at Irvine. There too, a sense of a chaotic situation where you could do much as you wished. The university had only been founded a decade before I got there. And again, there was that sense that we youngsters could do things. And at that point, there really was a kind of the sense that the old guys didn't know what they were doing. They were all guys at that point. The first woman in the department was appointed with me, actually, in 1974. But just to illustrate that sense of possibility and freedom, the department at Irvine, we had 4 straight, I counted it up thinking about this talk, we had 4 straight associate professors chairing the department, and just one after the other. I was the department chair 3 years after getting tenure. I mean, it was just sort of, again, that sense of possibility. I guess so I'm talking very about sort of very broad contextual things which happen to intersect with my personal story. Two last components of that. One is the fact that, looking back, I would say that 60s generation of French historians was in some ways the first to have a fairly intimate knowledge of France. And I think the contrast between the generation immediately before us and the people who started work in the 60s and early 70s, it was just incredibly difficult before about 1970 to get much contact with France. Jet air travel, it just transformed things. Bill Beik, as it happens, told me that he had taken a ship to France when he went to do his research. Some sort of Russian combination freight and passenger ship. And all of this had a symbolic or crystallizing statement from a figure named David Peakme, who was a very early editor of French historical studies, pioneer of French history, distinguished professor at the University of Washington. His name is on one of the book prizes that the French Historical Studies Society gives. David, in about 1965, 63, published what came to be known as the Peakme Thesis, which was the argument that French historians should not even try to match the kind of archival research approaches that characterize European work. We couldn't get to the archives that well. We couldn't, we weren't familiar with France in that way. So that what we should be doing is works of synthesis, and that was David's position. In addition, there was a sense, and I actually was with David in Paris at one point, and you realized that although he'd been in France, he was a distinguished French historian, he was not comfortable there. And I think very few of that generation of scholars, despite many experiences, really were at ease in French academia. I think our generation was, if not the first, close, very near the beginning of actual sort of interchange with France. The idea of being invited to give courses in France, or to participate in seminars, to publish in France. All of this was largely absent from the scene before 1970, and has become completely normalized now. That as another element of possibility, and then one final kind of, I guess what Aristotle would call a material cause, a kind of background situation that transformed what American French history was, is what you could call the hautes études moment in French intellectual life. And that's the emergence of an institution, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, initially a sort of dependent element of a pre-existing institution, the École pratique des hautes études, which was founded in the 1870s or 80s, and that became the home of the Annales School. So, if you've heard of Annales historical writing, French historians presumably have, but others probably not. That became a kind of institutional accompaniment to the journal itself and to the historical writing that went with it. And what was extraordinary about the Hautes Études as they developed right out of the gate, basically. I think they became a independent institution in about 1972 or so. Americanization was actually part of the program for them. And I think this was a kind of actual, almost a marketing strategy, certainly an intellectual strategy of a turn to the United States. And so a series of close relationships with exchanges with American institutions. The cutting edge of that was at Johns Hopkins and at Michigan. We wound up with an exchange program with them at Irvine. There was no such exchange during my graduate life at Berkeley, but all of a sudden, French luminaries were spending serious time in the U.S., making serious contact. All this to say, we had a new relationship to France, I think, starting after 1970. And that provided a kind of intellectual click, I think, that matters, a sort of transformational moment. Because although in the US, French history was sort of anchored by the revolution. I mean, doing the history of France was either doing the prehistory or the post-history of the revolution. Once we sort of came into closer contact with the French scene, then we encountered a world where that was not the case, where of course French history entailed all sorts of periods. In fact, I think one of the hard things for us to internalize as Americans about the French intellectual scene is the degree to which the study of the early modern period is actually divided off from the study of the revolution. That these, in France, these are two essentially separate fields, and especially up until about 1985, these were two antagonistic fields, two fields that didn't speak very much to each other. The French Revolution is an autonomous area in in the French historical curricula, has its own institutes, its own journal, and very often has its own politics, so that the French Revolution specialists, especially in 1970 or so, tended to be on the political left. The early modernists tended to be on the right or on the kind of moderate socialist kind of center. And especially after the 1968 rebellion, whatever you want to call it, after the events of 1968, for a time, the two fields barely spoke to each other. So our generation, it seemed to me, all of a sudden had a different model for thinking about the French past. And I think this, can see this as a kind of social history that shaded into an intellectual history, but just having a different set of relations to France and the French. All of that, sort of opened up this idea of thinking about the old regime, not as the old regime, not as the precursor to a new regime, instead thinking of it as a distinct early modern period, and so approaching it in that way. All of this sort of as a series of kind of structural changes or social historical changes that in a pretty predictable way generated, I think, a kind of different take on the French past. It seems to me that there's one element in the experience, certainly of my own scholarly development, and that of much of my generation. One way in which is a kind of surprise in the story. And the surprise has to do with the prominence of elites in the thinking of my cohort of French historians. To some extent that includes Jim, it includes Bill Beik very much. Mac with his earlier, Mac Holt with his earlier work, even Jim Farr, who I guess some of you have encountered, Jim, whose work began with working class people, but who has written a book also on the sort of judicial aristocracy milieu. And I think this has been an area that is fairly extraordinary in that it's a topic almost entirely neglected by the French until Anglo-Saxon and especially American scholars got there. And I stress that as a very surprising fact just because for the last 75 years, French historical study, French history, has been just an incredibly fertile, inventive, innovative kind of domain, an area that has given all sorts of hypotheses and ways of thinking to other scholars. That has not been the case with the study of French ruling groups. The judicial elite, the courtly aristocracy, the military aristocracy. Again, of course there have been studies, there have been figures dealing with these people. I'm offering very excessive generalizations. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that this is an area where American thinking has influenced French to an extraordinary degree. The other, I would say the other area, or two areas perhaps, one is a sort of semi-independent area, which is the study of the state. And again, I think there are two American scholars that brought something radically different to the table. And then the other real area, I mean, I say that the state is not quite a distinct area because the study of elites and the study of the state have been very closely overlapping, at least in American work. And the other area, of course, is feminist scholarship and the study of women, which was almost completely neglected by French scholars until very recently and has been, again, a byproduct of contact with American work. Even today, when a lot of this has, there's been a lot more absorption of these perspectives in the French context, even today it's extraordinary in French seminars, the number of debates that are centered on American arguments, on the arguments about absolutism as a collaboration between elites and the state, for instance. That remains a kind of central issue among French historians who are nonetheless debating American hypotheses. So I guess one of my questions, and it's where I want to spend some time now, is to ask, what was going on in that? What was going on with our choice of elite studies? My own work, I'm not going to say much about the substance of my work, although I'd be happy to do so. My own work has been sort of on the basically the full range of ruling class groups in French society up to 1800. The judicial nobility, the sort of provincial, both gentry, sort of lower level nobles, and then some mid-level power players, some on the court aristocracy. Jim referred to the book on the Roland family, one of the very great families. But I'm pretty representative in that, I think. I mean, so maybe I'm an extreme case, but I think there are a number of us, have sort of moved to that field very early on, and so then the question is why, and what does that mean about the relationship of American thinking, or the place of American thinking within the French intellectual context, within the sort of schemas of French historical research. One answer to that is simply to do with, so one answer to this mystery. The mystery is why us? Why was that field there for us? And one answer is, which I'll come back to, is the French had left it alone for a very long time. Now, the two founders of the Annales school, Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, founders of the journal Annales, as it happens, had both written on the nobility, and one of their projects in the 1930s was a collaborative study of nobles across European history. Febvre's dissertation way back in 1905 was a study of sort of local nobles in Franche-Comté. Bloch in French oral history talks a lot about this. So that had existed. It then died off after before World War II, actually, and definitely was not taken up in the post-war world. Or was very hesitantly taken up. The first significant study in this direction was Jean Mayer's dissertation in 1966, enormous dissertation on Brittany. But Mayer, interestingly, in his bibliography says, actually the pioneer in this was Robert Forster at Johns Hopkins. Just straight out says this, it's the Americans who opened up this field. That is the second part of the story. We had a few examples of serious work on elites done by the older generation of American historians. Bob Forster's dissertation on Toulouse, which came out in 1960. Russell Major's work was sort of at least related to that. And then we had a incredible, monumental example from another field, Lawrence Stone's Crisis of the Aristocracy. Has anyone heard of Lawrence Stone? Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, okay. All right. Crisis of the Aristocracy came out in '65, and I don't think any of us, of course, didn't think we could imitate that. And it's one of the great it's an enormous classic of 20th century historical writing. So it's not that we thought we could do this. We may have thought I did think I could do something like Bob Forster's book, which is a dissertation kind of book. Lawrence Stone's was not that kind of book, but it was the sort of thing where you said, well, there are 4 or 5 books in here that I could write one of them, possibly. So that feeling of Anglo-Saxon models. So there's the absence of the French, there's the presence of some older generation American examples. All this very much the classic kind of academic insider, inside the lines kind of story. Doesn't seem to me that covers it, though. And I think that what's interesting to me is, as a deeper level of explanation, a deeper level, why is it that Americans turned in this direction, and why did we come to dominate this field? I think a deeper level brings us back to this 1960s political context. And it increasingly seems to me that politics lurks in the background of a lot of these internal developments within the historical profession. Now, for France, that was very straightforward and clear-cut. French scholars tended to think until astonishingly late, until the mid-'80s, I would say, that if you wrote on nobles, upper-class figures, that's where your political sympathies lay. And so that there was a very clear politicization within France of that, that the sense was left-leaning historians wrote on peasants and workers, right-leaning historians, and there were some, wrote on nobles and magistrates. The archetype of this, of course, was Roland Mounier, who is a dominated the Sorbonne in the 60s and 70s. The early modern center at the Sorbonne today is named the Roland Mounier Center in his honor. François Bluch, who wrote on the 18th century parlementaire of Paris. François Bluch, I think, was to the right of Mounier, actually. He's very, very conservative.
Such a thing as possible.
Yeah, I know. I'm not certain of that. I met Mounier once. I never met Bluch. So there was that sort of crude politics assumption. I think there was also an underlying, maybe less firmly stated set of assumptions to do with how with the degree of control that different social groups had over their destinies. So I think that underlying a lot of the political choices among French academics was the notion that the rich, the powerful, the people at the top of the status hierarchy had control over their situation in ways that those lower in the hierarchy did not. And I think one of the ideas I tried to bring to my scholarship right from the beginning was the idea that the sort of big social forces in different ways hit everyone, and that the rich need to be understood as also puppets whose strings are being pushed by some larger forms of by some larger social forces. That social freedom exists, it exists for all social groups, but that in studying the aristocracy, the magistrates, these various groups, that in studying those, what needed to be disentangled were the forms of constraint, the ways in which their evolution as well was product and not simply volitional, that it was produced by social forces. Another idea that it was sort of in the background through these in these years was a notion, and it's linked up to all these political kind of strands that I've been trying to capture here. An idea that social groups have essential qualities, that the qualities are sort of baked into the groups. And of course that applied particularly to thinking about, for instance, the old nobility, the traditional ruling groups of Europe. Applies also, of course, in much scholarship about peasants. There's a set of assumptions that these social formations have distinctive ways of thinking, and those distinctive ways of thinking can be found in Russian peasants or Russian nobles, French peasants or nobles, that all 15th century peasants or nobles and 19th century peasants or nobles. That essentializing streak, I think, was also an important part of what we might call the historical mentalité, because I don't think this is an idea that was spelled out typically. It's not something that was argued or debated. It was instead a kind of background assumption about how you approach these social groups. For an American scholar, certainly I think this is what happened with me, and I suspect it's what happened with a number of people working in these directions. I think for us American scholars, it's just been easier to step outside from those simplifying schemas, especially in thinking about ruling groups. Maybe that we feel more, obviously, well, it's certainly that we feel detached from a lot of these long-standing enmities. You know, the politics of France are not our politics. We don't have any dogs in these fights. We can be good-natured and sort of try to get inside the skins of aristocrats in ways that perhaps, certainly in the 70s, French scholars had difficulty doing. I also suspect American universities create simply a different take on social power from what happens in French universities. One of the extraordinary things about the United States as an intellectual zone is the fact that the future billionaires now, and the future impoverished professors basically have, wind up passing through many of the same institutions. Not my own institution at the University of Buffalo, where we have few future millionaires, but kids who go through Princeton to learn to be historians, and those who go to learn to be hedge fund traders. There's a kind of overlap in American life that I think is a real feature, and it's a feature that's particularly powerful for those who spend a lot of time in universities. So I think there's a sense of contact with social power that's different for us. The French cursus honorum, the tracks the French go through, from the time you're 19 or so, you don't have anything to do with people who are not going to be featured. I mean, I'm overstating yet again. But you go to the Hautes Écoles de Commerce, you go to Polytechnique, you go to one of the big sort of future career schools, or you go to sort of an academic kind of track that far less mixing. That's just a set of random hypotheses. But again, I want to suggest that politics lurks in these stories, that as we try to understand the texture of American early modern studies, especially early modern studies of France, this is in part a story about political experiences, political moments, and political systems. All of this, culminated in a series of intellectual choices that I'll just quickly run through. Longer than I wanted. Quickly run through, because I want to conclude with coming to a political problem that seems to me we're confronting right now. The intellectual choice that I think Jim exemplifies. I think I do the same kind of thing in my own work. The intellectual choice is to bring social elites into social history. And if you want to sum up my generation's contribution to French history, that seems to me one of the lead kind of achievements we can boast of. We're interested in looking how did families work, how did careers work, looking at the mechanisms of people's lives, and that's what I mean by bring into social history. What happens when you take on a judicial office, an army office? What is the experience like? How does it work? What are success and failure, and how do they work? That can easily be misread, and I think my own work is sometimes misread in that sense, as saying that the nobles, the elites, were kind of too calculating, too rational, too self-interested for failure. That we're arguing, uniformly for successes of the French and indeed the European ruling groups. Certainly my own work, the argument is not at all that. I mean, you can screw up just as well when you're bringing a rational, we know from our own experience, people trying to make money often fail. And that's certainly the case with my nobles. So, you know, I'm not trying, my work is certainly not concerned with minimizing the degree of noble failures and so on. On the contrary, I think it's an important set of problems. But the starting point has to be mechanisms, looking at how things work, looking at the workings of self-interest as they played out in these social realities. So, you know, I've tried to sketch how and I think we got there, and to sketch sort of what is kind of central contribution that I, and to some extent we have tried to bring to the table. But I want to finish with a troubling intellectual paradox that certainly looms in thinking about my own work, looking back, and I think to some extent looms for the 68 generation as a whole. Paradox is this, broadly, crudely stated. Intellectual projects that I've described, my generation's French history, our forms of social history, have coincided and are working these out over the last 3 or 4 decades, have coincided with a dramatic rightward drift, not only in the general political culture, but to some extent in the culture of the historical profession. I think that the sense that the ways of thinking we encounter now are, you know, are well to the right of the points where we started out. That, of course, can best be seen in thinking and rhetoric around the French Revolution, which is almost, you know, just as an assumption treated as a, you know, a negative or at least extremely problematic event to a degree that was unimaginable, would have been unimaginable, I think, in 1970. Unimaginable not just to Pinkos like myself in those days, but to ultra-establishment figures. I've mentioned David Peakme. David's work, you know, celebrated to some extent the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. Even better example is the figure of R.R. Palmer, who was the author of the great textbook, ultra-establishment figure, professor at Princeton and then at Yale. And yet, someone who treated the French Revolution as, you know, the age of democratic revolution, as a, I think the shift to a more conservative kind of position can be seen as a fundamental change. So I guess the paradox I'm trying to raise, and I've had a lot won't try to run through all the thoughts I have. Be happy to spell this out more in the discussion. The paradox I'm trying to raise is how did we start out with this very 1960s project? And I see myself as very much coming out of this 1968 moment. How is it that that we've ended up in a social history that essentially is deeply, or at least seems to be not a celebration of social power, but certainly not so much has lost touch with the kind of critical thinking about societies and how they work that was actually a hallmark of French historical writing in the kind of pre-68 sort of moment. I guess what I'm asking is, what's the contribution of our generation of historical work to the somewhat troubled ideological world we live in today. What, you know, if the scholarship of the '68 generation comes out of a politics, has it also gone into a politics? And, you know, how do we theorize that that interplay between what we've done about exploring the world of social elites, about sort of getting inside the heads of French social elites? How do we sort of think about that, given the sort of corresponding shift to a sort of elite-centric world that we now live in? So I'll just leave it with that somewhat dark line of questioning and just open things up.
I'm going to, as chair, say a couple of things.
Yes.
That you know, just to buttress a couple of the points you make to sort of give an illustration. The one about the Equalities Attitude.
Yeah.
That's how I got to France in '75. They used to have bourses, which don't exist anymore. And my trip to France to do research was on a bourse of the École Pratique des Hautes Études, as it was known in those days. So there were a number of us who went there on their funding, which was aimed at Americans, and that funding has long since disappeared. There's other funding, but that funding doesn't exist anymore.
There was the countervailing side, because of course the Hautes Études were also financed by the Ford Foundation.
Right.
So that the transatlantic interplay is extremely interesting.
And you know, it was interesting at Columbia in the mid-'70s, John Munday, the great medievalist who worked on Toulouse, was a close friend of Dewald. So he brought the Walladarie to Columbia, and so I got to meet him there, and that published my first article. And the second thing I would mention is the stuff you talk about, how the French have been way behind in the history of women in early modern France. And I think you can see this if you look at Dominique Godinot's Des Femmes dans la France de l'Ancien Régime. There's now 2 editions of it. And you can see in the second edition, she didn't change it very much, and she got raked over the coals in the reviews for not really making it up to date. But virtually all she did in the second one was crib stuff from this volume, Women in Work in 18th Century France. It was edited by Daryl Hafter and Nia Kushner. And I thought it's just so interesting that all of her upkeep from that is basically from Anglophone scholars, because there really hasn't been very much done by French scholars. A little bit of stuff, but really not a huge amount. The third thing which I would mention is talking about, because we're used to the conceptualization of an early modern France, where the French would say La France moderne. And in a lot of ways, for the whole generation in France, this came out of Denis Richet's little essay, Penser la France moderne, which was '73, I think. And Richet, of course, jointly with Furet, published the History of the French Revolution in '65, which really started that whole process along. So he ran the seminar for a long time, which is still going on. I've been there many, many times. And so that seminar played a seminal role. And I think, you know, when I spoke at the Collège de France a couple of years ago, a few years ago now, and they were going to publish the volume, and they were, you know, what's the title of the volume going to be? And I said to them, and I was talking with Philippe Hamon, who's a Breton historian who teaches at the University of Rennes, and I said, well, you know, I wanted the title to be Repenser la France moderne, because that's what I'm trying to engage in here, look not only at the state but at society, and bring the two of them together, because it's not only about elites, but exactly the point you were raising about the political division. To work on the state was to be a right-winger.
Yes.
To work on society was to be a left-winger. And the two, one of the things that always struck me when I was first starting out is that the people who worked on French society, when they had to talk about the state, had no choice but to accept what the right-wing historians had said about the state, and conversely, the right-wing historians, when they were talking about the state, and they wanted to bring in something social, had to turn to all the analystes, because there was nobody on their side who would dare do anything on the social history.
And, you know, fitting with what you described, Denis Richet is a figure who matters to Jim and me as on top of everything else, as the sort of influence on Robert de Simon, a close friend of ours. Richer was a student of Roland Munier.
Yeah.
So that the affiliation from this extremely conservative, state-centered historian through Richer, who then is part of the process by which the French Revolution gets repensé indeed. Yeah.
And so I thought it was very interesting that the only review I saw in France that was done in Figaro, of all places, and that was very amusing. And the title of the book was La Monarchie Républicaine, and the guy began right off the bat by saying, you know, basically something to the effect that this ought to be called the Repensée de la France moderne, because he's trying to bring out, you know, he's trying to engage with Denis Richer, so at least he had enough intelligence to realize that was going on. I was pretty impressed by that. I asked Robert who this guy was, he had no idea. Of course Robert would not know somebody writing for Figaro. Or if he did, he wouldn't admit it. But in any case, so, you know, you can see a lot of these patterns, I think, and the other pattern which I would bring up is that my mentor at Columbia was a Dutch historian.
Yeah.
Right. And the people, I went to Columbia to study Russian history, and then all the people left or had bad things happen to them. And you know, my comprehensive board was a Dutch historian, a Polish historian, a Russian historian, and a French historian who I had never seen before prior to my comps, Mr. Wallach, and that was by far the worst part of my comps.
Who just arrived from...
Who had just arrived. Then he started asking me questions about Joseph II, and I thought, who is Joseph II? What does that have to do with me? I thought it was really cruel of him. But
I
just
almost went
this
to
kind of chaotic training.
I almost went to Columbia, and I was all set to work with the guy they fired. Who was it who worked on the suburbs of Rouen, Darnétal or something?
Oh, really? Yeah, that was a bit before my time.
Jeffrey Kaplan.
Jeffrey Kaplan, yeah. And so, then Orest was there and left after 68.
After 68.
Right?
So the sense that we, you know, we're just doing whatever we felt like, you know, with serious cause, not something I would recommend.
No, and the way you would encounter people would be sometimes bizarre. Like one of the people who was on my dissertation board was Julian Franklin.
Yeah.
Right? The great
historian.
Great historian of political theory of 16th century, 17th century
But
Europe.
not in the history department.
No, he was in the political science department, and they had a political theory section of the thing. The only time in my life I ever met Julian Franklin was at my dissertation defense, right? And so I didn't get very much direction on him about my thesis, and yet, you know, I'd read all this stuff and I knew about him. So yeah, it was a very chaotic. And I never took a single class in French history in graduate school, which is probably why I have a different take than other people. All right, so we'll open it up to questions. Yes?
Do you see a similar trend towards the right among French historians? And or do you think the American trend will influence that?
I do think it's a sort of Euro-American trend, and I think it's happening for independent reasons there as well. And they, you know, the people I tend to hang out with generally would not be comfortable with that description of what's happening to them. But yeah, I think that you know, many people who were, you know, very sort of hardcore left are now much more sort of indeed les républicains. I mean, that's one reason that your book title resonated. That the kind of centrist move is very much very widespread.
So you see that with older historians and also with newer ones coming up?
Yes, I would say so. Now, again, they would not accept my characterization.
But you might think about how the seminar at the Equalities Attitude at this point, there are a whole lot of doctoral students over the last 10 or 12 years who've done studies of specific elite families. I mean, their project is really about the Robin elite in Paris above all.
But also regular noble Americans.
Right. And so that, I mean, when you think back of where they were in the 80s, let's say, and what the kind of work that's being produced there, the groups they're studying are pretty radically different than they would have been 30 years ago, I would say.
I guess, you know, the other thing that interests me, and this is something I'm actually trying to, my current work is actually a study of the prehistory of the French Revolution. So I'm sort of going back to 1958 or something. But I think what's striking is this work is being done completely without reference to the revolution or to a concept of the old regime. That indeed, if you raise that kind of question in the artist formerly known as the Décimant seminar, it simply, you know, doesn't compute. I think that's they are truly seen as two distinct fields, and that seems to me ultimately a loss. You know, that yes, it was wonderful to create this autonomous early modern field, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's striking that then the revolutionary denouement is now completely to the side from that. And that seems to me a political statement.
If you think about that in one way, in intellectual terms, Goubert published his book on the Ancien Régime in 1967, right? And then they later, the first volume, and then they turned the two volumes, he and Votion in the early 80s. But the first volume didn't change very much. An interesting thing to me was always about that volume, which I think has had a big long-term impact on precisely what we're talking about here, is he dated the Ancien Régime as ending in 1750, right? And to him, the Ancien Régime was a social and economic construct, and what was there in France in the second half of the 18th century was very different. And so the parameters of the Ancien Régime in a certain way, or La France moderne, in a certain sense, ended in 1750. And I think that's had a really big impact intellectually on the field, and it does create this rupture between the revolution and La France moderne.
Sorry.
Well, I don't want to cut you
No,
off.
no, please.
It strikes me when you're talking about, excuse me, the history of your field, and how things ended up being the way they are, that this is similar in other fields as well.
Really?
I mean, it's not limited to France. Central European history, I think, was much more receptive to Americans much earlier. For a variety of reasons. In the German case, because of the overwhelming dominance of Nazism, 2 world wars, the whole Sonderweg argument, which Americans participated in to a great extent, plus the fact that the whole concept of Stunde Null meant that the next generation of German historians were extremely influenced by the victors and the notion of normative history that came out of that. Now, in my own field, I do Austrian history. Austria, for a long time, was relegated to the sideline because it wasn't a nation state. It disappeared rightly because it wasn't a nation state. So doomed Austria is the way it is. Well, my generation, which is just a little bit behind yours, revolted against that notion. And I say we, the Anglo-Saxons, mainly Americans, have led the way in reevaluating the Habsburg monarchy. All the, in my opinion, most interesting work comes from us. And Austrians are very receptive. But there was never that kind of hermetic attitude that the French had about their own history versus outsiders coming in and interpreting it. So I think part of it has to do with people perceiving, as you say, from the outside, looking in, realizing that a lockstep view of history over a long period of time simply isn't correct, that there's more imaginative and perhaps more correct ways of interpreting it. And so finding that opportunity and stepping in and having an influence on the native historians, so to speak, who realize that for whatever reason they've been stuck in a kind of interpretive lockstep themselves. And in the Austrian case, there's a lot of reasons, but not least of which is a 19th century concept of how you do history, which the Americans coming into that field didn't have. And so now we influence their history. But one other thing specifically about the French, and I think this also again relates to Central Europe, and the whole notion of a Sonderweg, that you have to follow a certain normative pattern, whether that you should have been a nation state instead of a multinational state, or you should have been completely democratic the way France supposedly was as a result of the French Revolution, was a belief that there is a direct line of development, that states are supposed to be nation states, supposed to be democratic, supposed to be based on bourgeois values, and supposed to continue progressively in that direction, and that modernity is linked to that. But what's happened in my field anyway is a whole questioning of where modernity comes from. And it doesn't have to come from the bourgeoisie, it doesn't have to come from successful revolutions, it can come from the top down, where the same values that were claimed by liberal ideologies coming out of the Enlightenment can also be claimed by a dynastic state and a bureaucracy and an academic intellectual world that absorbs it and institutionalizes it in a different way. So I think all of these things are going on. It's not just isolated to your field.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think what's maybe specific, I mean, indeed, it's, yeah, I think post-war scholarship and the whole entry of America into kind of equality with the European scholars, you know, partly, again, the World War II, the emigre scholar wave that, you know, transformed American universities. I think what is unusual about France and our relationship to it as American scholars, and not as in fundamentally different, but the special path that we wound up taking, is that it involved an extremely self-confident, even triumphant French historical profession. And so that I think unlike the German case or the Austrian case, it was a question why not only were Americans sort of integrated, but then these specific American approaches. Because I don't think this happened in many areas of French scholarship. This did not. But I think the interesting thing is the degree to which the study of elites became a kind of American sort of infusion into French thinking.
Well, I mean, it's the same in Austrian history.
Yes.
Actually. You know, the positive interpretation of the monarchy comes from us.
Yes, and of the Austrian aristocracy, which has been important.
Rohan in Austria as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, one of the other things which perhaps I would say is a little bit different about France is that on the one hand you have the enormous role of the Annales School in the broader conception of history in the 60s and 70s with people. And you know, it's hard to imagine, but like when we were first in graduate school, these books, Dewald and Goubert, were just brand new, basically, right? And they were coming out, Barral and, you know, Perrault and all these other people were all coming out while we were in school in some cases, or certainly getting to America for the first time. And the other thing is the role of that scholarship on an empirical level and the theoretical writings of Foucault and Bourdieu, both of whom relied very heavily on the empirical scholarship of Annales School for their theories about various things. And that still had a tremendous resonance even today.
Well, you know, Bourdieu and Derrida were professors in the Annales School. So they're not a separate world, they're you know, down the corridor.
Right. And it's, you know, to me that's one of the fascinating elements. The other thing which I think you see a little bit of, and here I see a big difference between Paris and the provincial universities, where there's a real rupture in France between the two right now, in my view. And one of the things that's interesting is that the old social paradigm of the Annales School, the questioning of that, which has also been done by some Americans, is now taking place out in the provincial universities, where people are going back and re-examining issues like social mobility or geographic mobility. They're re-examining, you know, the relationship between the people of the forest and the people around them. And there's a whole bunch of stuff like that that's almost all out in the provinces. There's very little of it going on in Paris that I've seen.
One thing I didn't have time to mention, but I think another distinctive feature of what changed in the 1960s is Americans going to the provinces, actually. That, you know, just showing up at these, some of them extremely godforsaken archives.
Like everyone.
To take a random example, hanging around Jim's office, I was describing that you used to be able to smoke in the reading room with your 17th century documents in front of you. There was nobody around.
Do that in Beirut.
Okay. We'll treasure it.
On the cherry too.
But I think that, you know, I was trying to say that our relation to France changed. It was different from that of the previous generation.
Oh, radically different.
And one manifestation of that was this idea of just wandering into these places as opposed to staying in the
Matt told me Russell Major just took one big trip to France and microfilmed everything and then never went back.
Yeah,
He felt so uncomfortable.
And Russell, you know, Russell was a wonderful guy, but his French was terrible.
Right, no, I know, and a lot of people in that generation.
David Peakme would be the same.
Yeah, no, their French was really appalling. I know, I can remember listening to, oh, God.
I guess, I guess what's striking is that we encountered no sort of that kind of radical self-questioning that the German world experienced. That the French didn't question their World War II until the 1970s and 1980s. Again, actually, as a result of American scholarship. So that the encounter was a specific form of this general relationship between America and Europe.
To follow up on your point about the logistics, the first time when I went to, when I was doing my research in London, when I came back on a boat.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because in those days,
yes.
the apex fairs were 22 to 45 days, so they were totally useless
Yeah.
if you're going over to Europe to do research. So
Yeah.
you flew over on Icelandic Airways.
Exactly.
And it stopped in Reykjavik and went to Luxembourg and then took the train and all that horrible stuff.
Yes.
And then on the way back I took the boat because it was half the price of flying because you only had to buy one-way tickets.
Yeah.
And so the logistics, even in the mid-70s, I mean, now we have, you know, used to something very different.
So you talked about sort of the uncomfortable parallel trajectory of this elite-centric scholarship on the one hand and elite-centric rightward politics on the other hand. But I was wondering if you could reflect also on the role that this sort of elite-centric scholarship has had in changing the perception of the study of France within the historical profession. Do you think there's any relationship to what's often termed, I'm not sure quite fairly, a crisis in French history and this moment, or are those unrelated phenomena?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. I would put, you know, I do feel there's a crisis in French history, so I don't see this as a so-called crisis.
Okay.
But I would locate it elsewhere. I think that the crisis ultimately has to do with the place of France in the world. And that precisely, you know, that's one reason I started in thinking about all of this. I started by thinking about, you know, why on earth did I get drawn into France? I mean, I had no family connection to it. I first, you know, when I think the time I encountered Bill in Toulouse, that was the second time I set foot in France. I think I was drawn to it, and I think many of us were out of a sense of what France represented. And I think the sense that France does not represent anything so significant now is, you know, underlies some of this crisis. That there's none of that drive to re-understand the modern world through this particular case. Whereas I think in the 50s and 60s, that's what it constituted. And I think other places now play that role. Perhaps in French history, I think, you know, other themes play that role. Obviously, empire, ethnic issues, the encounter of the place of France in the world. All of these, you know, I think have that sort of centrality. But I think the question now, indeed, the notion that you would wait eagerly for the next 800-page thesis on French peasants, very hard to recapture that is a world we have lost. But it was a world that was around in 1970. So that would be my take on the sources of crisis that we're feeling. But I think you're right that the shift to elite studies has done something to the field. And I think it has, I mean, in the nature of such studies, and my own work is like this, you enter into these groups and you sort of adopt or try to figure out their ways of seeing things, you sympathize with their take, you know, it's just, that's the way you do good work. But of course that undermines the notion of history as a social critical discipline, or at least it challenges.
So one of the reasons why I referred to it as a so-called crisis was that one thing struck me in both your remarks and some of the remarks that Jim added on about your respective graduate trainings, as being sort of unspecialized, a bit ad hoc, cobbling together a committee of different influences, not necessarily in French history per se. And this is a conversation that I think a lot of people are having right now that seems to sort of betoken a yearning for a lost world of specialization, where we were all studying under committees of French scholars who gave specific topics down from on high and told us exactly like what archives to find them in. And the description of your trajectories actually sounded a lot like my own. I mean, I had a British scholar on my committee who was incredibly influential in the development of my topic. And that sort of cobbling, that seems more familiar than it is different. So perhaps not everything has changed.
No. You know, my nostalgia. You know, I had a wonderful time in graduate school. You know, but some of that wonderful time is that it worked out. Which you know, and you feel like, you know, these sort of David Copperfield stories, where sure at the end, you know, it all comes out. I guess what I wanted to capture, you know, was not meant to be like, gee, I sort of wish I'd had some direction. No, I had none. And, you know, you make incredible mistakes. You know, but I simply wanted to capture why it seemed possible at that point, basically to go, you know, in this sort of different direction about this whole academic field. Which, you know, is sort of a different. It's certainly not a yearning for for having a, you know, dissertation topic handed to you and so on and so on. But with the recognition, it was also very painful.
The other thing that here is very different from a place like Columbia when I was there in the 70s. So first of all, we had a lot of those European emigres on the faculty. Almost everybody who taught me was a European. The only American who taught me was Gene Rice, who was the most European American I've ever met in my life. Remember Gene?
Just from my senior honors exams, they had outside examiners. He was
you know, he was as European as it gets. But the thing that was amazing about a place like that is that you could go take all kinds of classes, or like I took Russian literature with scholar Rufus Mathewson. I worked for Zbigniew Brzezinski's Institute, got to meet all the people there. You know, when I taught contemporary Civ at Columbia, the whole faculty that taught it met every Wednesday for lunch. There were 50 sections. And so I got to listen to Arthur Danto and Sidney Morgenbesser argue about Marx for an hour and a half, which was one of the great hours and a half of my entire life. It was totally useless in helping me to teach Marx to undergraduates, but opened my eyes, to say that much. And actually, that was the other time I met Julian Franklin. He just published his book on John Locke, and he came in and explained how you teach John Locke. And, you know, those kinds of experiences, you know, I'm sure you had similar ones at Harvard when you had these big universities that, I mean, at Columbia, if you want to take a lit class with Michel Riefeter, well, fine, just go sit in on it. What's the big deal? I used to sit in on John Monday's lectures, right? He had his wonderful class in a medieval town that had like 10 people in the class. And he taught in an auditorium that sat 250 people, and you could not get a seat. People just came in to listen to him.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? It's brilliant stuff. And, you know, we don't do that here. We don't have that here. We don't have that kind of faculty. We don't have the kind of resources. The French department doesn't even offer graduate classes. And so the atmosphere has to be very different in a place like this than it is in a place like that that's a much bigger university and has a faculty. And you can get a totally different kind of training. The other part I would say is that, you know, I've always noticed a significant difference between people like me who were trained overwhelmingly by Europeans and people who were trained on the West Coast or wherever by a faculty almost all Americans who got their PhD in America. And those two different approaches are pretty radically different, I would say. Each have their strengths and weaknesses. And ideally you try and draw from both, but they're very different approaches, there's no question. And a lot of the chaos that you talk about comes from having European professors who have absolutely no experience with academic life. We were talking about this not that long ago when Anjay was here. We were talking about Anjay and how they were totally useless when it came to the practice of American academic life. Because what do they know? Right? And so, yeah, that's not a part of the lost world that we have to bring back. I'll say that. So, maybe one or two more questions. Jake?
So you mentioned a little bit about France and the world and how they're trying to, this is an important kind of thing, and how, I just wonder how you see the rise in colonial scholarship, imperial scholarship changing or affecting this shift towards David been speaking about.
Yeah, you know, this is something I've thought a lot about in terms of early modern studies. You know, I don't have much to say about the new colonial scholarship just on its own. But what has struck me over the years is the place of the imperial imagination in the construction of French social, the French social history of France itself. That is explicit and then endlessly implicit comparisons between the peasant village of the 16th century and the African colonies, the primitive mentality. Indeed, it would, you know, Lucien Febvre took his concept of mentality from an pretty disturbing anthropologist of the early 20th century, who's, you know, who very much was about the primitive mind and so on and so on. So that bond persisted through the scholarship of the 70s. I mean, Goubert, I think, you know, was a fairly mild manifestation of that. Le Roi Laguerre is very powerful influenced by that way of thinking. So, so I think what has been interesting is what happens when you take an intellectual support beam out from under a structure. Because, you know, once you can no longer speak about colonized peoples in those ways, once you have to shift your anthropology, basically, what happens to the study of France itself? And I think what's happened is a kind of intellectual crisis that hasn't really been confronted or identified, but is very profound. Because it, you know, in the 60s, I would argue, people wanted to read about French peasants because they thought it would guide them for how to deal with the third world. And that, like I said, the comparisons were strewn through the works of those years.
Yeah, for a second here, John, I do want to jump in on something very specific here, because a number of years ago I had one of our graduate students works on the Middle East, Elizabeth Williams, you probably recall. And Elizabeth was writing a dissertation on late Ottoman and French mandate agriculture in basically now Lebanon. She was going to do Syria, but for obvious reasons couldn't get to the archives. And when she was doing this seminar paper, she was looking at Syrian peasants for this paper. And I said to her, you know, what this person is saying is taken from Turgot, and it's not taken from his philosophical writings. It's taken from what he wrote as Intendant de Limousin.
Yeah.
And I said, you know, I know that this is what it's from because I've read that and I recognize the stuff. So she went back and found out, all right, so the guy who was in charge of agriculture in Syria was a guy named Jacques Verlus, right? He was part of Marc Bloch's History of Peasantries of the World.
Yeah.
He wrote the first volume was Bloch's, the second volume was the Histoire des Paysans du Syrie, right, by Verlus. All right, Verlus's father was a guy named Georges Verlus, who you may be familiar with, wrote on physiocrats, wrote a biography of Turgot, right? And so he's the guy, and then Verlus's book is then used by guys writing on Algerian peasants and West African peasants. And so you can actually literally trace the smoking gun of all of this. And then it comes back, as you're saying, it comes back again into Goubert, because they are looking for the empirical justification that their perception was that a Syrian peasant in the 20th century was roughly the equivalent of a French peasant in the Limousin, a really backward place, in the 18th century. And so the terminology, the language, the same thing you see in Brittany, where you read descriptions of Breton Gaelic-speaking peasants, and you know, just change a couple of words, and then you could be talking about any part of the French Empire in the 19th century.
I guess my question is, and this is another feature of this, you know, do we have a crisis, or do we have something? Not a crisis, perhaps a twilight of the gods kind of problem. What happens when the social functions of your discipline shift? You know, when what you are contributing to the larger enterprise comes into question, because that is definitely what happened with this imperial relationship to homeland France social history. And I think what has been interesting is that the empirical level is infinitely higher now than it was 40 years ago. On the other hand, the social functions of our kind of knowledge, have shifted, and we're left with perhaps the social functions of our knowledge about elites and our sort of turning toward them as one of the lessons that are being utilized from our work. I'm not sure about that last part, but I'm very sure about the kind of loss of faith in what the old regime can teach. That's what